Okay, so today we're going to cut through the noise. I want to talk about one of the most important levers in the US economy with my friend Tony Blodgett. Let's talk about interest rates. Like, should the Fed be pulling them down right now? What's happening with jobs and the slowing market? What's happening and why is the Fed waiting? So we're starting to see a lot of pressure build for them to cut rates at the Federal Reserve. And I wanted to bring on the one, the only Tony Blodgett. You're a EVP at New American Funding, their head of retail, my homie since high school, investor extraordinaire. Tony, what's the Fed's dual mandate before we kind of beat on them, just to kind of set the stage for people about what we're going to chat about today?
Yeah, well, Anton, thanks for having me on here. Always good to connect with you. So the Fed really has, as you mentioned, a dual mandate. One is price stability, right?
Yep.
So that we think about inflation when we think about price stability. What are they doing with their monetary policy to make sure that prices in the United States stay at a reasonable level, right? The other side of their mandate is full employment, right? So they really want to maximize the employment environment. So if unemployment starts going up, if too many people aren't finding jobs, it's a sign that there's weakness in the economy, and they may need to use their power to influence the federal funds rate, their monetary policy, to help ease that pressure so that we see more jobs come back to the market. So it's really between jobs and stability of money.
And what is the Fed fund rate? You're a mortgage guy. Literally, it's the overnight rate. But how does that end up affecting mortgages and things like that?
Yeah, so big misnomer about the Fed funds rate and how it impacts mortgage rates. The current Fed funds rate is 4.25 to 4.5 right now. And that literally is the cost if a bank, which oftentimes, as they need money to meet their requirements, they're borrowing that money from other banks and or the government. And that's the rate that they're borrowing at, overnight. Literally, like the shortest amount of time that you could possibly borrow money is overnight. When we think about 30-year mortgage rates, we're at the way other end of the yield curve with everything from 1-year notes, 2-year notes, 5-year, 10-year, right? In between.
Yeah.
And so there is not a direct correlation between the two. However, there is a lot of historical data that shows, that the 10-year will follow much closer to the overnight cost of funds. So when the Fed's lower rates, you typically would see the 10-year come down, although not always. And then mortgage rates will then follow that. But what we have seen historically is this spread between mortgage interest rates and the Fed funds rate. And that we can track pretty closely. And look, all the rates along the yield curve in a normal, stable environment will follow the same trend. So that's why it's not horrible to look at what the Fed's doing, or even look at the 10-year if you want to know what mortgage rates are doing, but they are not directly correlated with one another. And there are times where we see a separation, but typically it's for a short period of time. Typically there's something going on in the economy that's driving that, and and that's not very normal. And they typically do line back up to their normal spreads, historical spreads.
Yeah. I called you and I said, "Hey, brother, man, what's going on with this jobs report? This is the worst blowout." And then someone said this morning, like, that was the worst revision we've had in 31 years or some crazy number like that. Like, it was 2 times bigger. So the jobs report comes out. Walk us through that, because those were brutal numbers where we missed by a mile.
Yeah. Well, honestly, Anton, it's much worse when you look at the underlying data than when you look at the headline. The headline showed 73,000 new jobs. The expectation was 110,000 new jobs. So on the surface, you might go, yeah, that's a miss, but it's not a horrible miss. What you're talking about is the revisions, where they revised the previous 2 months, and it was 258,000 lost, 258,000 jobs less than what they had reported.
A quarter million.
And if you took that same type of similar adjustment and you applied it to this month's reading, we would have had a negative jobs report, and the previous ones would have just been, 18,000, 17,000 new jobs. I mean, it would have been significantly lower. And so that's why, I mean, and you saw bond rates, you saw mortgage rates improve significantly on Friday. I think the bond market was up 48 basis points. So pretty material in its movement. And it did not, a lot of times with a move like that, you'd see a retracement towards the end of the day, some profit taking. We did not see that. We ended the day strong and started this week strong as well. So it does feel like there's some optimism on the long end of the yield curve with what's going on with the jobs data. And I just wish that Jerome Powell had that data on Wednesday when he did his commentary and they made that monetary policy.
I almost want to, I feel like it was clear he didn't have that data. Like, I feel like that data should almost be leaked to the Fed beforehand, that way they don't feel surprised the next day, because the way he was pretty hawkish in that meeting.
Yeah, he's been using his language around strong employment, for many, many months now. And you're right, it was off the mark. But here's the thing is, the timing, it just so happened that the timing of the BLS jobs report happened to be the day after the Fed, announcement. It doesn't always work that way, so it wouldn't always make sense, obviously, to leak that information early. It's just the way that the timing fell. But what is interesting, Anton, is that typically you would see, one of these job reports in between Fed meetings. We're actually going to get another jobs report before the next Fed announcement in September. And so this is a unique timing where we're going to have two jobs reports, this just being the first of the two. And so people are giving a lot of weight to this, and there's a lot of change in what the predictions are going to be for September. But I think people forget we got one more jobs report to get through at the 1st of September, the first Friday in September before that happens. And then we also have two reads on inflation, which I know we're going to talk about here at some point on this conversation as well before the next Fed meeting. So I know that the expectations have jumped significantly for a Fed rate cut, which I believe we should have, and I can tell you why I feel that way. But Jerome Powell's very data dependent, and we got a lot more data to get through before that decision's made. Yeah,
let's throw those up on the screen so everyone can see these. Understand that, so this is the CME FedWatch tool. The CME FedWatch tool basically is a prediction. So this is showing a quarter cut. It's showing a 93.4% chance of a quarter cut in September. This was just at 40% during that Fed meeting. When you go to October is now showing a 61.8 of another quarter cut. And you go to December even. Look at this. December is slightly better than half at 50.5, pricing another quarter. So the CME Fed Watch tool right now is literally predicting 3 cuts by the end of the year today. Now, of course, this could change with the next set of data, but it's pretty amazing for it to flip-flop that quickly.
Yeah, we were at 1 last Thursday, and now we're at 3. Yeah, for sure.
It's just wild. And then you had also mentioned something about when we talked labor participation rate, that kind of changing these overall numbers and how that would make the unemployment rate even worse. So kind of explain that again. That was really good.
There's multiple things that impact that number. One of which is, you got to remember that when people become unemployed, for a long period of time, they fall off of the basically eligibility for the being counted in those numbers. So, and we have seen people that have, been unemployed for whatever reason, not finding jobs, and then they fall off of that number. And that makes that number, it makes it look like there's less people that are out looking for work when they very well may be. They're just not counted in the numbers. Obviously, I think that what's happened with the focus on, deportations and crackdown on some of that, obviously, and people not coming across the border, there's a lot of jobs that would have been filled by folks there that, that's going to have an impact. I don't know how significant that is, but you start adding these things up and you start changing the numerator here on this equation, and it definitely has an overall impact.
I was reading, Tony, that if the labor force participation rate was where it was and it was adjusted, because there's basically approximately something like 1.8 million Americans that are beyond the 27 weeks. So like you said, then they drop off. If it was adjusted for that, like the unemployment rate today would be as high as 4.9. And in the FOMC meeting minutes, they had talked about, unemployment rate rising to maybe 4.5, but at 4.9, that would be definitely above the mark that they were even predicting for themselves. I mean, just crazy.
Yeah, the prediction for this year was revised from 4.2 to 4.4. We're at 4.249, so almost rounding to 4.3. So, that's material. If you look at what the Fed had said, early on in the year about what their expectations were, to me, that was a line in the sand that said if we got to the 4.4, they're going to have to do something. They have to then admit that we don't have a strong labor market. There's another factor here when it comes to, the people seeking full-time employment, and it has to do with another thing that the administration has done here recently, which is making it so that people have to look for jobs in order to maintain some of their, Medicaid, Medicare, and some of that stuff. So there's some people who maybe weren't looking for jobs that have fallen off those roles, and now they're going to have to look for jobs in order just to maintain benefits, or they may not be receiving benefits, and so they have to look for a job because they need the income, to offset what they might have received through any of those welfare programs out there. So that's another thing that would actually move us in the other direction. We'd have more people showing up on the radar as looking for employment.
Interesting. And then what are your thoughts on tariffs and their impact to inflation? We haven't really seen that show up yet. Are we still waiting on it? Jerome Powell keeps pontificating that, we got to wait. What's your feeling there, sir?
Well, look, I would like to lean on the fact that, in April, and we haven't seen any reads on inflation, and say, hey, what's the problem? This is a big nothing burger. But and I would love that as a mortgage guy. Like, I want to see rates come down. But look, I understand that there was significant buying ahead of the tariffs, right? So massive loading up of inventory. That happened. There is, still some tariffs that have not been fully negotiated. And I don't believe that we've seen the full impact of the tariffs pushed onto the consumer. I think it's like anything, Anton, when you see a price change in your cost of goods as a business, you don't want to shock your customers overnight. So you might be willing to eat that difference for a while so that you don't lose customers, and they look for a cheaper source. But over time, you're going to trickle that in. And I have to believe that's what Jerome Powell is thinking, because I don't think the tariff move itself clearly has not had a negative impact on inflation. But is there those underlying, the reality of how business works that's going to delay the implementation by the companies that are absorbing these tariffs right now? Or are not really subject to them because they loaded up on inventory ahead of the implementation of the tariff. So there's definitely those underlying things that we got to be honest with ourselves about that could find their way into the inflation numbers. But I want to remind people, as I do often about inflation, inflation is the increase of cost of money over time. Yes. So with these tariffs, what we typically would see is like a one-time blip. It would just jump up.
A price shock.
And that, yes, in that month that happens, that would show as inflation. But as long as it doesn't go up again, it doesn't read into the inflation numbers. And so I think everyone's waiting for that, that jump to show up. But no one thinks that this would lead us back to what we would call transitory inflation, right? It would be a small window of time that the tariffs would impact inflation. Now, for consumers, it impacts us indefinitely because they jump up, they stay there. But the fact that it doesn't keep going up month over month means it doesn't get picked up in the inflation calculation. And that's a big difference that people need to remember. Doesn't mean costs have gone down. It just means they haven't gone up any further.
Exactly. So also we had two Fed governors, dissent and vote for rate cuts. We haven't seen dissents like this once again a really long time, and that was Governor Waller and Bowman. What do you think this signifies? What is this telling us? What should we be paying attention to here?
Yeah, so you're right. Michelle Bowman and Chris Waller both dissented, and the reasons they gave were a softening job market.
Yep.
And that inflation, is on target despite the tariff implementations, the things that we're just talking about. So, this is not news to anybody. It's just they turned out to be right when it came to the jobs numbers. And, and I think the reason why you saw people expecting the quarter in the next meeting is because, there's two of them already saying it. Then it was supported by the jobs number that came out Friday. You're likely to see more people jump on that bandwagon of the voting members of the Fed, which I know we're going to talk about that probably here a little bit as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, I just think they were right. I think that a lot of people felt this way. And they got it right. And I think more people will jump on their bandwagon, which is why we have optimism about, future rate cuts.
So has Jerome Powell waited too long? Is this getting political? What's your feelings or your thoughts in relation to that?
So I personally think that he's waited too long.
Yeah,
I think that even if we're going to see some mild inflation data creep up for a period of time, I still think that we're at an overly restrictive monetary policy to be neutral, right? We're not neutral right now. We are restrictive. And I would argue we're too restrictive. So I talked about this on my podcast. I think that we're at least 50 basis points too restrictive. Even if you want to be neutral, we don't need to be accommodating, but we just want to be neutral. And we're 50 to 100 basis points above what I think would give us a neutral stance. So to me, the fact that he's waited this long to the point where we start seeing jobs reads like we're seeing now, that means you've waited. That means you've waited too long, in my opinion. Now, look, I also explain this as the Fed wants to have ammunition, right? I think about this as like bullets in a gun, and he's got a full magazine, to unload on this when he needs to. And as he said, he can move fast. I mean, they could do 50 basis point drops quickly if they need to. And that's what he's leaning on. He's leaning on the fact that, we can go fast when we need to. But we've seen this historically play out that when you wait too long and the economy starts slowing down, cutting rates that fast doesn't just ramp it up as quickly as you would think. And, there's a long tailwind to both increases and decreases. And holding for this long, in my opinion, is the wrong move. We shouldn't be down at easing or accommodative, but we should be closer to neutral. And that's where I think that he's missed the mark.
Yeah, and there's massive debate over where that R-star or neutral category is. Like you said, some say it's 50 basis points, some say it's 150. If we just go in the middle and call it 100, we're very, very non-accommodative. We're very restrictive. So with the resignation of Kugler, Kugler's put in resignation. Trump's going to get an opportunity to appoint someone. How does this disrupt what's currently happening? Do we get the shadow Fed president put in now? What's your feeling on that one?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, Anton, they almost have to put the next Fed president in now, because what a lot of people don't realize is that the next Fed president has to be a current member of the Federal Reserve. And so if you look at the list of people, like Chris Waller's on there, but a number of the other potential candidates are not currently part of the Fed voting members. And so they almost have to put the next Fed president. So this could be very telling, which is going to happen this month. Yeah. This appointment could be very telling about the way the president's thinking. So I think this is the implementation of the next Fed president, perhaps highly likely. And now keep in mind that there's 19 people that vote on monetary policy, but only 12 of them vote on any given month. And I'm not going to go through it. We don't have time, but the bottom line is that the other 7 that aren't voting, they rotate through there, right? So. Yes. This seat will be one that will be rotated through, I believe. And so I don't know how much, their decision is going to directly impact the votes moving forward. And we only had 2 dissenters. So I don't expect this to be a major shakeup. I think the big news of this will be that it's going to telegraph who is likely to be the next Fed chair, because that's probably who they're going to put in, because they only have until May to get somebody on there if they want to make them the Fed chair. And this would be a great window of opportunity to do that. But yeah, it's definitely going to move, things a little bit more towards the president's agenda, since he gets to select who goes on that board.
Yeah. So interesting. To be honest, I was in the camp of not thinking about what you just said about how they've got to be a part of the Federal Reserve in order to be the chairman. Interesting. Any picks for who you think it is?
Well, I personally would love to see Scott Bessent in that seat. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yes, I agreed. We also need him at the Treasury. That guy's brilliant.
Exactly. And so that's tough. But, if I had my choice, I would see that. There was some talk of, could he do a dual role? I think that's a huge mistake. But yeah, I don't have all my notes in front of me on who the candidates are. But yeah, I think that would have been my top pick if I had one.
Yeah, no worries. And so we've also had this political assault on the independence of the Fed. Rumors of, can Trump fire the Fed? What's your feeling on that stuff in particular? Because, honestly, I think it undermines our financial markets as a whole. I don't think it's good, to have the president, push this much on the Federal Reserve. I think that we've got great capital markets. But what are your feelings there?
Yeah, as much as I would like to think that the president's pushing on the Fed because he wants mortgage rates to be lower for all of us that work in mortgage and real estate, the reality is that's not the reason why. The president's agenda is much more around the cost of the federal government's debt and what it costs to service that debt. And I think his agenda around lowering of taxes, it leaves some pretty big deficits on how we're going to fill that. And if we could bring down the cost of the government's debt, that in and of itself helps bridge that gap. So I think people need to remember that's why you're seeing the pressure from the president to bring that number down. That's, I believe, his main driver. All of us in mortgage and real estate want it lower because we want rates to be lower, borrowing costs, so on and so forth. But we got to remember what he's trying to accomplish there and why he's trying to do it. But yeah, look, Anton, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we need a separation of church and state, if you will, here when it comes to the Fed. They're supposed to be independent. And I do believe that Jerome Powell is independent. You asked earlier, do I think it's getting political? I don't think Jerome Powell is political. Yeah, I just haven't seen him be political in either, direction. And so, look, I don't agree with how he makes his decisions. And we've talked a little bit about that. But I believe he's been consistent, right? His message has been consistent. His decisions have been consistent. Now he's using bad data. He's using, BLS jobs numbers that are not accurate, things of that nature. But he does seem to be following the data. He says he's following the data. So no, I don't think he's being influenced politically. But I'm just saying, it would be difficult with all the hate and rhetoric from the president to not let that impact you. I mean, he's just a person, right? But I do not believe that his decisions are politically motivated. Although it is interesting that right before the election, he did drop 50 basis points, and I don't know. So
for all of our mortgage people, our real estate people, let's put this on a bow for them. Where do you think rates are going? What's that going to do for loans? What's that going to do for real estate over the next, 12 months? What are your feelings? What's your predictions there?
Yeah, so I think rates are going to continue to improve, and I feel a little bit like a broken record or a clock that's right twice a year, because I've been saying this for a long time. It's just taken a lot longer, for it to get there. But the signs to me are there. Inflation is well under control, with the only wild card being these tariffs, and I just do not expect a huge impact from the tariffs. And if we do see it, I think it'll be short term and transitory. So inflation, seems like it's in check. We're seeing the weakness in the jobs numbers. We've been seeing this for over a year with all this isn't the first time we had massive miss on revisions. They revised all of last year. They were off by, a million jobs last year. So this has been commonplace. We've been seeing this weakness. So look, if you think about the Fed's dual mandate, both of them, we talked about tariffs and inflation. I think inflation's in check. The jobs is getting weak. I think you're going to start seeing them easing. They're not going to move super fast to do it. So I don't see a race to the bottom. I don't see something happening that drops interest rates significantly. But if we can stay on, those projections of, 3 more rate cuts this year, a few more rate cuts, next year, I think by sometime in the middle of next year, we have mortgage rates with a 5 handle. And that's what we need to see. That's what we need to see is the 5 7/8, 5 3/4 range. And I think that's doable. I just don't think it's going to happen overnight. It's not coming right around the corner. But I do think we'll see a slow descent, which is good for our industry to have this ease over time. We all love big drops in interest rates, but they're also disruptive in a lot of ways. It can cause prices to jump up all of a sudden because we have this massive inflow of buyers who want to get in on this opportunity. So we want to see it happen slowly over time. And we want to see people get to a place where they feel like with all the equity that they've accumulated in their home, they can afford to then take that, buy a new home. And yeah, they're going to lose their 3.25% interest rate, but they're not going to go up to 7. They're going to go up to something in the mid to high 5s. But they made a bunch of money owning that home, and they can justify that. Maybe even use some of that to buy the rate down a little bit to keep their affordability where they want it. It just frees up so many more opportunities. And I think that's coming. I just don't think it's going to happen quickly. I think we're still looking at the middle of 2026 before we really see this start setting in.
I totally agree, brother, man. And one of the things I want to give to our listeners that are in the industry is if that means it is 12 months from now before we get to, good rates, it means right now is the time to dig in. Right now is the time to start chatting with your database, make the content, do the open houses, chat with the agents, whatever it is you need to do to grow your business. This is your massive opportunity to do that right now. And then as rates slowly come down, you'll get a natural lift inside the business from that. So that just enjoy the ride, enjoy the blessing. Tony, how can people get a hold of you and also drop information about your podcast, sir?
Yeah, so I do a podcast, comes out every Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. It's called Market Shares. You can find it on YouTube and all your streaming platforms, or just go to marketshares.com and that'll direct you there. Probably the best way to get a hold of me is, maybe just Google my name and I'll come up all over the first page. My cell phone number is there. You can reach out to me anytime. One last thing I want to say, Anton,
yes, sir,
is for our mortgage people and real estate as well. Keep in mind, things don't move in a straight line. So even though we're talking about this slow descent, you guys, it's going to be like, like it's going to be pretty jagged as it goes. And in those, there will be pockets of opportunity where we might see pretty low dips in rates, but they'll be short-lived, with the long-term trend being improvement. Well, those small pockets, you need to capitalize on those. So have your databases ready, have your borrowers ready for volatility, and be ready to lock in those rates when those, opportunities present themselves.
Oh, so well said. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Tony, for your time. I appreciate it as always.
Take care.